sometimes they're imposing a cost on their fund. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing too is I was involved in the credit union industry through a lot of rationalisation as well. And I know there that a lot of larger entities took on the smaller entities, even though they might not have had the perfect loan book or anything like that, simply because they realised that they had an obligation to the industry as well to help the rationalisation process. So I think there is a factor of that. I think as long as the larger funds aren't held to prove that suddenly their members are going to be better off as a result of the merger, which is almost impossible to prove, that should be just a consequence of a sort of industry rationalisation.
Okay, so you see the biggest impediment then in terms of how a trustee board might be approaching whether a merger is in the best interest of their members versus any other impediments preventing them from happening going forward?
Yes, I think so. I think it's, are we expending costs here for something that doesn't really benefit our members? And it might be that longer term there's a small benefit, extra scale, but it might not be something very material if you're taking the really small funds versus the really large ones.
Okay. You're right in focusing on us making sure that we best manage what could be potential risks with any changes to the architecture of the system. The way that we've approached the changes to the default arrangements with just new job entrants was with the conscious mind to making sure that as the tail of entrenched underperformers gradually disappears, and you have a competitive dynamic through best in show, we didn't want to do that in such a way that it created a world of, as some have suggested, cosy oligopolies, albeit we're still struggling to work out how 10 funds every 4 years exposed to competition could be considered a cosy oligopoly. But we tried to do it in such a way that from the members' perspective, it didn't create instability. And so when you look at the numbers, so of the about $150 billion every year going in terms of contributions to funds, the new job entrants are about $1 billion, the switching and the re-entrants is about $2.2 billion, and the turnover is about 16.5. So you've got about $19.5 billion of the $150 billion that would be subject to the greatest amount of movement to the top 10. Even if you assumed a material uptick in switching rates, including in default and from choice, it's still not enough to sort of herald a major change in the cash flows such that apart from the tail slowly disappearing, for the middle and larger size funds that are still good funds, they'd still be having very healthy flows. And that was the purpose of our transition modelling. Just good to get your sense on the way we've structured it. So they're the sort of flows that are being impacted and the sort of amount of consolidation that would then occur being digestible for APRA to help sort of sherpa that all through. And for trustee boards to play their role as well.
Yes, so I think the best in show, like we think it provides a really good safety net for the small percentage that might end up being truly unengaged, because even in your report highlighted that with the best in show, it's probably going to be a lot less that actually don't make a choice. We also think it's a really good competition threshold for all other funds to sort of be able to benchmark themselves against, and a good test for advice, as you mentioned in your report. It's hard to know the impact on the funds that will be just out of the best in show, to be honest, and I think that's where the concerns are. Like, I personally think that it puts the pressure on them to identify what niche they are filling that's different to the best in show and what benefits they have. And I can only relate, I guess, to my personal actions is that a long time ago, I switched out of a major bank into a credit union because I liked their service ethos. Now, whenever I saw, cheapest mortgages, I knew that credit union would never be in that list or anything like that. But that didn't make me want to go back to a bank because I knew they were offering me something different on the service side. So I sort of think with the people who are outside the best in show, yes, there's an option to get in the best in show, but maybe they won't, maybe because they're too focused on one particular industry that they won't make it into a best of show. But then I think it does create that incentive to really focus on what their niche is about. And not everyone wants to always go to, the headline entity as well, because there's other features that the others can offer. So I think their concern is if they're not best in show, will they eventually disappear? And will they have no brand power, no marketing power, and eventually they disappear? And I understand that concern, but I also don't think in practice that that's what would happen, because I don't think that's how people behave. I don't think people necessarily just follow the headline entities everywhere, but it is one of those concerns that is expressed. And I think that the best in show does raise other risks which have been highlighted, which is the politicisation of the selection of them, the risk of getting the selection criteria right from that expert panel so it doesn't drive. And I know you've said you don't want it to be driven to lowest cost or worst or short-term investment performance. So I guess making sure that that selection criteria is right so it doesn't create the herd mentality or short-term investment performance. But they're the risks that would have to be managed.
So maybe we'll go through each of those risks. On the second risk first, around the selection criteria for who should be best in show, we set out about a page of principles in our report, which would sort of go some way towards mitigating the herd risk mentality by saying things like long-term net investment returns, innovation, products in accumulation and in retirement, data and knowing your members, good governance, so it's quite a holistic list. I think we're hearing from the feedback post-draft report that we probably need to go further and be a bit more prescriptive to mitigate some of those potential risks. And indeed, we had a very good conversation with Australian Super yesterday, with one of their very sort of their smart portfolio guy, Alistair, about how we could probably take those criteria further so they would be a substantive part of our final report to mitigate some of those risks. On the risk of politicisation, and this is one that we've been giving some further thought to, we're very conscious that the current system, it's already well accepted that the appointees there are very politicised, whether it be the FWC or the expert panel within the FWC. So that's kind of a given. Because we're dealing in a world of compulsion, we felt that the expert panel needed to be accountable to government, needed to be accountable to the members. So the appointment by government to us was the way that they were accountable to government, and accountable to members through having an incredibly transparent process that was really only about a best in show that was in members' best interests. I guess then people suggest, well,